Institute. My name is David Brown. I am Director of Public History at Leo Baeck Institute. And for those of you who came by this another way other than our mailing list, I'll just let you know briefly that Leo Baeck Institute is a library and archive based in New York with an office in Berlin. And we're focused on the history and culture of German-speaking Jews. We're based in the Center for Jewish History here in Manhattan. And we have an enormous and fascinating research collection of archival papers, library books, also art and objects. And I hope that when things are less chaotic in terms of the virus, that you'll come see us in New York if you can. And we also do programs like this a few times a month. And this program is especially important to us because it is the final installment in our year-long series focused on our shared history project. So we have a project right now called Shared History, 1700 Years of Jewish Life in German-speaking lands, which you can find on the internet at www.sharedhistoryproject.org. And this is part of really I guess I can't exactly say global, but Europe and North America wide celebration or commemoration, really focused in Germany, but the Leo Baeck Institute has contributed. That's looking at the entire history of Jewish life in the area of, let's say, Northern Europe, in places that at one time or another became German-speaking. And we've, on our website, collected 58 objects. That's a little more than one per week that we've had that are representative of this history. And we've invited scholars, journalists, community members, various experts to write contributions on these objects, which range from the first documented evidence in the historical record of a Jewish presence in the Rhineland from 321 CE, which is a law, a decree issued by the Roman Emperor Constantine at that time for Germania Inferior, to the eyeglasses of Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish philosopher, to an East German moped manufactured by a company that had been founded by Jewish brothers in the 19th century in Thuringia, to this week Stolpersteine for the Frank family, that for Anne Edith and I think Margot Frank, yeah, which are in Aachen. And we've come to a period in this history that's basically caught up to the present. And we are going to talk to three experts on this period, the post-1945 German Jewish history, and get into a conversation about how this history fits into the idea of 1700 years, what use this sort of imaginary concept of 1700 years or German-speaking lands, Jewish life in German-speaking lands, what relevance that has for Jewish life in Germany today, and some of the conversations within and around the Jewish community in Germany today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We're going to start with Atina Grossman, Professor of Modern European and German History and Women's and Gender Studies at the Cooper Union, New York. Her numerous publications include Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany. And she is also a co-author and editor of A History of Jews in Germany since 1945, which is sort of the comprehensive work on this period in German and English. So thank you, Atina, for joining us. We're also joined by Max Cholek, who lives in Berlin. After studying political science at the Technical University, he earned a doctorate at the TU's Center for Research on Anti-Semitism. Since 2009, he's been a member of the poetry collective G13, which publishes books and organizes lectures. And together with Sasha Mariana Salzman, he was the initiator of Desintegration, ein Kongress zeitgenössischer jüdischer Positionen, and the Radical Jewish Culture Days at the Maxim Gorky Theater. He's published several books of poetry, including Druckkammern, Jubeljahre, and Grenzwerte. And in 2018, his nonfiction book Desintegriert euch was published at Karl Hanse, followed by Gegenwartsbewältigung in 2020. Finally, Darja Klingenberg is a research associate at the Faculty of Social and Cultural Sciences at the European Viadrina at the European Viadrina University in Frankfurt an der Oder. Her research interests include migration and mobility, the Russian-speaking diaspora, feminist theory, and the sociologies of food and humor. She earned her PhD in social sciences at the Goethe University in Frankfurt with a dissertation on the sociology of middle-class Russian-speaking immigrants in Germany, which is also the topic of her book, Wohnen nach der Migration, Materialismus, Hoffnung und Melancholie migrantischer Mittelschichten. So we're going to try to cover this whole 1945 to the present period relatively quickly to kind of do a 101 overview, and then get into how that history shapes and informs Jewish life and the kinds of discussions that people are having within the Jewish community and about the Jewish community and in dialogue with the Jewish community in Germany today. And I'll start with Tina, since you were very closely involved in the writing of this book, which I highly recommend, edited by Michael Brenner, there we go, A History of Jews in Germany Since 1945. You can find it in German or in English. Tina, I talked about how we're here basically because the Leo Baeck Institute has participated in this initiative, sponsored largely through German government funding, to celebrate or commemorate the idea of 1700 years of Jewish life in Germany. And I mean, it's inherently interesting to look at what was happening 1700 years ago in the Rhineland and the nature of society there and the participation of Jews. But this construct sort of imagines a continuum of 1700 years that reaches until today. And we could talk about lots of reasons why that's not quite so. I mean, starting with the fact that there were no German speakers, at that time in Cologne. But I think above all, for our conversation today, we have to grapple with the fact of the Holocaust. We talk about this as a Zivilisationsbruch, a rupture in civilization. And in mainstream German society, there's also this idea of a literal tear in the fabric of time, when people talked about Stunde Null. So to what extent can we talk about continuity between the pre-war German Jewish community and what happened starting in 1945? And I know I've asked you to do a lot there, but maybe you can briefly give us the overview.
Right. I mean, I think the very short answer to that very complicated question is very little continuity. And the medium short answer is I really do recommend the little summary that Michael Brenner and I put out on this shared history virtual exhibit, which is much more succinct than I ever managed to be in these situations. The somewhat longer answer, but still hopefully brief, is that it's a changing and complicated and sometimes confusing picture, starting with the by now I think very well-known irony that at the time that the National Socialists came to power in 1933, there were, give or take, depending on how one counted, somewhere around 500,000 Jews in Germany, less than 1% of the population, as we have to point out, and that in 1946, 47, after the Shoah, after the final solution, there were once again up to, fluctuating with time, 250,000. In other words, 250,000 compared to 500,000, 250,000 Jews on occupied, defeated German territory. But for the very, very, very most part, those were not at all the same Jews who had been counted in 1933. And also for the very, very most part, that was a temporary situation, and they left Germany sometime between 1948 and 1950 after the establishment of the two German republics, and after the opening of the United States finally, and then also places like Australia and Canada. So right after the war, or in the years immediately after the war, I think, I just want to say three things. One is that Germany under the Nazis, and even during the war, was, of course, never completely Judenrein. Jews survived. They survived in hiding. They survived passing. They survived as slave laborers. And above all, it's a very small number. Above all, they survived in mixed marriages, or because they themselves, were the product of mixed marriages. So there were Jews in Germany throughout. In that sense, yes, a very minuscule continuity. And then once the war was over, you get this very diverse group of Jews in Germany, somewhere probably around maybe 15,000 German Jews who could be counted after the war. But again, you have Jews who emerged from having having survived within Germany, some German Jews who did return from Auschwitz, or some particularly elderly Jews who returned from Theresienstadt, from Terezin, Jews who returned from so-called exile. That's a whole other conversation to be had, whether that word applies, particularly from Shanghai, a group of several hundred Jews who returned. There were also former German Jews who came with all four of the Allied armies as soldiers, as cultural officers, as chaplains. There were a larger number of Jews, particularly East European Jews, who also came with the Allied armies in those positions, in the Red Army, as well as in the British, mostly in the American, and even in the French, Dublin famously. There were Jews who came with aid organizations, particularly the Joint, and also the Jewish Relief Unit from the United Kingdom. So you have different groups of people, and you also have, and that's Max will talk about this, you have several thousand, and 2,500, 4,500, the numbers keep fluctuating, German Jews who returned mostly to the Soviet zone, having been, for the most part, political exiles. And maybe that's the group to whom the term exile actually applies, but not only to the East, also to places like Frankfurt or Munich or Berlin. But then the second point is, the really significant one, and which accounts for the vast majority of the Jews who do gather on German territory, occupied, albeit in the West, in the Western zones, predominantly in the American zone, were East European Jews, mostly Polish Jewish survivors who arrived as displaced persons, as refugees, and actually, for the most part, as illegals, as so-called infiltrees, who were once again fleeing renewed persecution in Poland. These were people who had never, for the most part, been in Germany, although it is important to say that this distinction between East European Jews and German Jews is a very sort of blurry one as well, because a significant number of German Jews in Germany before the Nazi period were also East European and weren't even German citizens. But in any case, those were East European Jews. They came as DPs, they came from Poland. And there the key point is that the vast majority of that group, this Sherit HaPleta, the saved remnant, themselves had survived not as survivors of death camps or labor camps, or were the partisans, or in hiding, or passing as Aryans, although that was certainly part of the group. But the vast majority of that group, perhaps 80%, had survived because they had been in the Soviet Union, in the unoccupied Soviet Union, first in special settlements as Polish citizens, and then in Central Asia, and then were repatriated. So for them, their primary experience of the war and the immediate aftermath of the war and the confrontation with what had actually happened, with the catastrophe, with the Churban, as the East European Jews called it, came from having been in the Soviet Union and in the far regions of the Soviet Union, and then in Poland. And that was the majority.
So we have, you alluded to the fact that this migration of Jews from parts of Eastern Europe into Germany, and then the encounter with quote unquote German Jews, is an old story in German history, but here it plays out in a totally new scenario. So can you talk about, in the reconstitution of the Jewish community in Germany, how this relationship plays out between the small number of survivors, which, as you point out, have a connection to Jewishness or Judaism that is, I guess, for some in doubt or sort of mitigated by the fact that they were in mixed marriages or they were so-called Mischlinge. And then you have this much larger group with this experience you've just described as displaced persons. And this is basically what forms those who don't leave for Israel or the United States, form the West German, we'll get to East Germany later, the West German Jewish community. How does that play out, like institutionally and sort of in terms of relations between these two groups, like affectively and in other ways?
Well, with difficulties, although it really is important to say as we move along that one of the striking, perhaps, continuities, albeit under very different circumstances, in the history of Jews in Germany is that at moments when it seemed that the Jewish community in Germany was shrinking almost to the point, as Felix Teilhaber worried, even the Jewish demographer Felix Teilhaber worried even before World War I, that the Jewish community was on the verge of extinction because of low marriage rates, low reproduction rates, assimilation, and that from the 1880s onward, and then World War I and in the 1920s, the community was refreshed by an influx from the East. After the Holocaust, when people like Leo Baeck, famously declared the end of Jewish life in Germany, it was only to be commemorated and documented, but no longer lived. And when indeed all of those Jews who remained in Germany, whether originally German or East European, were effectively under a cherem, under a ban by international Jewry. And yet it was at that point that it was again an influx from Eastern Europe, mostly these Polish Jews, most of whom had been in the Soviet Union, who created the possibility for small Jewish communities to rebuild themselves. And then it happens again. We'll talk about that later. Daria will speak about that. It really happens again in the 1990s. So that's an interesting, continuity in and of itself. The the other point that I would want to make, which is maybe a little bit, counterintuitive, is that as much as there were tensions between German Jews, most of whom were elderly, many of whom had a more distant relationship to Judaism, precisely because that is what had enabled them to survive, but who nonetheless were able to take over leadership positions in Jewish communities once they started to kind of really establish themselves outside of DP camps. But whether these were German Jews or East European Jews, who for the most part were younger, had been Yiddish speaking, that for both those groups, they did not expect that there would be really revived Jewish life in Germany. Neither of them. Of course, there are exceptions. But it's noteworthy, as I think most of our listeners probably know, that when after the departure of the great majority of the DPs, and also of quite a few German Jews. My own grandfather was a dyed-in-the-wool Berlin Jew. He survived in hiding in Berlin, and then wanted nothing more than to leave as soon as he could after the war, in order to join his daughters and other family members outside of Germany. But when in 1950, the Zentralrat, the Central Council, was established, by the way, this I think anticipates maybe your next question, by the way, really at the prodding of Adenauer, who wanted sort of some central group of, that would represent these rather disparate and often arguing with each other groups of Jews to whom he could talk. When they established themselves, they called themselves the Central Council of Jews in Germany, which was, of course, a great contrast to the Central Council, a Central Council of Germans of Jewish faith. So they are, both groups kind of agree that there's no future, and yet there is a tension between the fact that in many communities, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Munich, that the leadership remains for the most part German Jewish and older, and the membership, as people are coming out of the DP camps, is predominantly Eastern European. That will play out again in other ways after 1990.
Thanks, Atina. So you mentioned that the founding of the Central Council of Jews in Germany as obviously a self-directed Jewish enterprise, but it also fulfills a need by the German state. And I was going to ask you about this, but I think maybe Max could also contribute on this. And maybe just to get Max into the conversation, I'll throw this question to you, Max. What role did the post-war German Jewish community play in German society, both both in terms of its symbolic function, like what did the German state sort of expect, or what was it able to claim because there was a new Jewish community there, and then also like what voice did Jewish people have in German society after 1945? But maybe you can start with the first part.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Atina, for the great overview up to that point. It's very complex, the whole thing, and to kind of wrap this up in just a few minutes is very difficult. You did a great job there. Let me try to connect right to that, because in a way, we have to talk about two different kinds of Jews here. And I think that is something that we talk about anti-Semitism is also true for the past. There's a split between the empirical group of Jews, which is as diverse and as, let's say, there's a continuum of difference entailed in the empirical group of Jews, by location, where they come from, by right, by relationship to religion, by all that kind of things. And then you have the symbolic Jew, which is a different Jew altogether, and it's already misleading that we are using the same word for this, because the symbolic Jewish position really changes after 45. It had been something like the central negative point of reference, an empty signifier, if you want. So Shulamit Volkov wrote about this as a constituent for German identity, especially German right-wing identity, but not only. Also, there was a liberal and a left-wing anti-Semitism in Germany as well. And now after 45, you see how the Jews become one of these central figures to prove the self-improvement or the overcoming of the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, in Germany, especially in West Germany. And now it becomes more complex because we're talking about two different countries, basically until 89, and they both have different stories. So if we look at West Germany, it's not a coincidence that Konrad Adenauer wants those Jews in the Central Council and really gives them a lot of money also to play that role, because he needs the Jews in order to reestablish a notion of positive German identity. And we find that also in culture and the appropriation of post-war Jewish voices, Nelly Sachs, Paul Celan, those people. And we can also see this changing or shifting as a paradigm around the mid-70s. And that's something that Michael Bodemann has been writing about a lot in the 90s, called The Theater of Memory. It's a great book published in 96. A lot of my work refers to that, which is the way the so-called Erinnerungskultur, memory culture, becomes more and more central for a reunified Germany in order to establish something like a positive identity that allows for Germany to become normal again, to take out the flags, to be proud to be German again, to found a Heimatministerium, Homeland Ministry, and all that. So you see a strong connection of the symbolic Jews and the German state and its identity, the performance of its identity in the theater of memory. So we have those two sides. So maybe to add to Atina, she was describing the empirical living Jews, and I was describing the eternal symbolic Jews, if you want.
I mean, I would just add, David and Max and Daria, and all of you out there who are already asking questions, I see, that, I mean, there's a really interesting, sort of paradox after the war in the Federal Republic, because as Max points out, the existence of a Jewish community, however small, is crucial to the Federal Republic's efforts to, reestablish itself as a legitimate player in the international community. And indeed, as was indicated, by this, famous quote attributed to, the American High Commissioner in Germany at the Heidelberg Conference in 1949, that the ability of a Jewish community to exist in Germany after the war would be taken as a, quote, Prüfstein, a touchstone of German democracy. So on the one hand, there is that symbolic function that, I don't know, it's not even imaginary, it's symbolic function for the government. And yet at the same time, there is this delegitimization of any kind of German Jews choosing to remain in Germany. Choice is a fraught word there too. People, for the most part, didn't actively choose, but ended up staying with the famous packed suitcases, even though mostly I think they were, people were too busy trying to acquire the goods in order to pack the suitcases. But this was, the legitimacy was for the German government, but for global Jewry represented by the World Jewish Congress, Jews were not supposed to be living in Germany. So there is that ban that to have to live with. And then the third piece of the paradox is that I think for the great majority of Jews living in Germany, both the remnants of the German Jewish community and the DP, I mean, it's no more 30,000 people altogether at most after 1950, maybe at points down to 20,000. They are living for the most part quite insular lives that are characterized by a kind, by distance, by suspicion, and by pragmatic coexistence, but not by feeling that they belonged, that they in any way belonged to Germany. There were, of course, some political actors. There were clearly important economic actors, but they were, as Dan Diener has characterized it, they were in a sense an absent presence. And they could be kind of mobilized or deployed as a sort of abstract community at certain points. Very important to mention, we don't have time to go into this, but of course, one key aspect of this is the reparations agreements, and particularly the Luxembourg Agreement in 1952, which again, I have to, refer people to Dan Diener's work. As he describes this, quite brilliantly as a negotiating table that has German Jews on both sides, except that one side of the table is speaking English and Hebrew, and the other side of the table is speaking German. So it is politically important, but not in the everyday lives of Jews. And if anything, there is also, we should not underestimate the really significant degree of anti-Semitism that exists. I don't want to say persists because it's different in many ways, that exists in post-war Germany, and a lot of it focuses precisely on this question of reparations and this sense that Jews have been the unworthy beneficiaries of Allied support, and then of money that could be used for speculation, all these old tropes and stereotypes. That is still very significant in post-war German life in the 1960s, especially combined with a real lack of acknowledgement, particularly of the Holocaust.
Thanks, Atina. So I don't want to give the GDR short shrift, but maybe we can link it all together and also get Daria in the conversation. And so Daria, you're a migration scholar, and I know that most of our audience probably knows that since 1990 and until today, the vast majority of Jewish people living in Germany are immigrants from the former Soviet Union, who came, 1990 to 2005 or something. Some 200,000 people, depending on how you count them. I know that's complex, and maybe you can talk about that. But to tie it back to what Atina was saying and what Max was saying, I mean, these new immigrants are in some ways in kind of a parallel situation to the DPs, in that they come and encounter a small but established Jewish community led by a sort of numerically smaller group that's nevertheless dominant, and in some ways they come to depend on that group for their integration, but they also play a role in this symbolic sense, don't they? For a Germany that wants to reunite and be, accepted, despite the fears of people in Europe who think a reunited Germany is dangerous. But of course, the influx of a large number of Jews helps with that perception. So could you talk about that migration and the sort of the echoes with the post-war period, both in terms of the encounter between, German Jews and Jews from the East, and in terms of the sort of symbolic importance of this new, much larger community?
I try.
Sorry, that's a lot, but I mean, we're trying to tackle a lot in general.
Yeah, but I think it's helpful we can trace back this Eastern and Western German history also to the beginning of the post-Soviet Jewish migration in 1990, because this migration history actually starts in the first freely elected Eastern German parliament, when Eastern Germany for the first time acknowledges and declares responsibility for the mass industrialized murder of European Jewry, which it didn't do before. And the first prime minister declares, kind of as a form of acknowledging this responsibility, he declares this broad invitation to Soviet Jews. And in the summer of 1919, among roughly 2,000 people follow this invitation. It's very adventurous. First years of migration, like my own uncle came with a tourist visa to Berlin and just went to Wilhelmstrasse, where he got a permanent residency for Eastern Germany. And after the reunification, this the new German government, and what's also important, that this Eastern German parliament decision was lobbied for by political Eastern German Jews who kind of prepared this decision. And in a very similar mode, the decision of the Western German government after, or the new German government after reunification, is also lobbied for by the Jewish communities, the established Jewish communities in the new reunified Germany, who hope to revitalize Jewish life. And what's important before I speak about the Jewish relationships, it's to place this migration in a broader German migration context, because in the 1990s, Germany had there was an anti-immigration policy. We didn't had any form of migration policy until 2000. So the only way to allow Jews to enter Germany was by utilizing a part in the refugee law that allowed to take in refugees through quotas or contingents. So the Soviet Jews came to, or post-Soviet Jews came to Germany formally as refugees, even though they were economic migrants. And they came into a Germany that in the 90s was structured by a very public, very loud racist discourse. So in parliamentary debates, there were racist tropes publicly said that would be very problematic to listen to them today. There were pogroms in places like Rostock-Lichtenhagen. There was a very tense racist and anti-Semitic atmosphere on the streets. And in this context, the Soviet Jews and also partly the ethnic German return migrants that came at the same time were relatively welcomed. So there was an exception. These migrant groups were constructed as exceptional. Like if you compare media coverage of the Soviet Jews in the 90s with, I don't know, Bosnian refugees, you see how these groups are made or pictured as very educated, seeking refuge from anti-Semitism in Soviet Union and seeking refuge in Germany, of all places. And in this way, fulfilling the moral compensation for the Shoah and kind of guaranteeing the representation of the new friendly and post-anti-Semitic face of Germany.
So I want you to go on and get to the second part of the Jewish relations, but just a clarifying question. When you talk about a racist anti-immigrant discourse in the 90s, that includes anti-Semitic Gedankengut or thought, language, whatever. Are you talking about, I mean, is anti-Semitism kind of peripheral to that, and it's more focused at, like, you know, you mentioned Bosnian refugees or Turkish guest workers, can you just clarify who is that directed at in terms of immigrants, if the Soviet Jews are more accepted?
Mm-hmm. Like the general racism in the 90s, there was a rise in racism already in the 1980s, directed mostly to the second generation children of guest workers. And this rise very much in the 90s with the Yugoslavian wars and the refugees coming in from Yugoslavia. And it was like there was an intermingling between the
Mhm.
anti-Semitic tropes that at this time mostly articulated them through secondary anti-Semitism, and parallel there was this anti-immigration sentiments. That at that time there was the development to forbid a double citizenship to Turkish migrants. There were just really racist campaigns by the Christian Democratic Party, having quotes like children instead of Kinder statt Inder. Like there were,
I remember that. That's
so it's just interesting to see how in this context the Eastern European Jews were kind of placed as an exception on the one side, while on the other side, on the labor market, they experienced the same structural racism that other immigrants experienced. So, and very quickly the discourse turned into problematizing this good refugees or this good migrants, because as they were mostly highly qualified, they did not integrate so well into the German labor market, which at this time just had no space for qualified immigrants. There was a problem with acknowledging the degrees, but also when the degrees were acknowledged, the people were just not employed because their expertise was not respected. And you can also statistically see the differences between those migrants who went to Israel or to the US. You see the severe structural racism that these groups encountered, and many of them ended up in as unemployed and depending on social welfare. And this is where also the Jewish relationships become more interesting, because the Jewish communities, the established Jewish communities, and by this time, established in this negative German-Jewish symbiosis, encountered those immigrants trying to find a place for themselves, and also having this double transformation, being an immigrant, but also being post-Soviet and needing to make sense of this post-Soviet experience. And in this encounter, the social welfare structures of the established Jewish communities did really a great job supporting some of the Soviet Jews who was finding jobs and accommodation, also creating supporting structures for the elderly, like bringing them into elderly homes, helping them finding doctors. But this relationship of helping and supporting the Soviet Jews also put them into a subjugated position as social cases. And soon there were discourses about these immigrants being too demanding, uncultured, ungrateful, coming to Jewish community only because they need support. And very soon there was also the discourse in the Jewish community and as well publicly of the Soviet Jews being not Jewish enough, being too Russian, bringing the Homo Sovieticus culture into the Jewish communities. And with Homo Sovieticus, it was that meant that they were just unfit for labor and life in a capitalist society. So in the public German discourse, this exceptional status quickly turned into a discourse about problems. And similar in the Jewish communities, these migrants encountered the expectation of a double integration. And integration, I know Max talks about it. Like integration is this very German concept, expecting creating an expectation that the immigrants would leave behind their culture and kind of acculture themselves into the host society, while this expectation is obviously unfulfillable. And I find it really interesting how the Jewish community that came out of this diversity that Atina just described and had this very complex, complicated, ambivalent, negative relationship to Germany, expected the Soviet Jewry who arrived to integrate into this really paradox relationship and overtake the culture and leave behind the very complex Soviet culture that these immigrants brought with them. So every time I'm super fascinated about how similar, how much the German Jewish establishment at that time in the 90s was integrated or had parallel structures to the German migration discourse in general, where migration is seen as a problem, where it's expected that newcomers leave behind their culture, even if it's like literally impossible to do this. There were discourses about problematizing the use of Russian, which is also like fascinating for me, how this multilingual group of Jews who themselves spoke Jewish, Yiddish, Polish, German, expected that the Russian-speaking Jews would take over, like leave behind their Russian, and why it was such a problem. There were like crazy discourse, like crazy struggles and fights in the communities about use of Russian language in the community newsletters. So, and last but not least, we also have a continuation of this anti-Ostjuden stereotype and this idea of the Eastern European Jew as uncultured, coming to Germany like with dubious reasons and not really representing the idea of what it means to be Jewish in Germany.
Yeah,
So
I would
Max,
just want to add.
hold on, everyone. Atina, if you can make your point very briefly, and then since we're talking about the contemporary Jewish community in Germany as primarily immigrants, I wanted to give Max a chance to talk about these questions of integration and relationships and potential for solidarity or discord between immigrant groups. But go ahead, Atina.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to underscore this sort of the paradox that Daria was raising, which is that, you know, Daria, you said the German Jewish establishment, and much of that German Jewish establishment, of course, in the 1990s, not all of it. I mean, you know, Galinsky had played an important role, himself an Auschwitz survivor, a German Jew for a long time. But that German Jewish establishment, for a greater part, were precisely the people who had been the outsiders and the people who were stigmatized also as not even genuine victims of National Socialism, but as economic migrants who just didn't, you know, like the situation in Poland and came flooding across the borders of occupied Germany. So the outsiders, in a sense, had become insiders and were, you know, now trying to set the rules. But one difference, that there's a lot of similarities, or as David, I think you said, a lot of things that rhyme there between the 40s and 50s and 60s and then the 90s. But one difference is that it was the Polish Jews, the former DPs, who saw themselves in many ways as being more authentically Jewish, and they saw the German Jews as being much less religious, traditional, you know, still holding on to this liberal tradition, and that kind of turned itself around in that it was then, you know, as we just heard, the post-Soviet Jews who were seen as not legitimate. I think we have to mention the 80s, but maybe we'll get back to that later, because they kind of set the stage, the coming out of that second generation of the tiny remnant of Jews who had stayed or returned.
I'll hold on to that, Atina. Hopefully you can bring it back into the conversation. But I do want to let Max talk about the idea of a Jewish population that is, I mean, it's both a minority, whether you're background is German Jewish or Polish Jewish or Russian Jewish or DP or post-Soviet or whatever. But then also in the vast majority of cases, literally in first or second generation immigrant, and how that positions the contemporary German Jews in Germany society vis-a-vis other immigrant groups, and also, you know, the larger society, which I think Daria already talked about, the expectations of integration. But Max, since you're our de-integration specialist, I'm sure you have something to say.
Okay, I've changed my microphone, so I hope my sound is better now, because people were mentioning there was a bit too echoey or something. So I hope it's going to be better now and I can speak in normal speed.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, cool. So I would like to elaborate a bit on something that Daria said about the consequences this had for the Jewish population in Germany, because if we focus, I feel like if we focus too much on the German Jewish established side, we lose track, we lose sight of the fact that over 90% of the Jews living in Germany today are actually the children or the actual people that came from the Soviet Union. So what we are facing today is a completely changed makeup of the Jewish population compared to the 80s. It just doesn't look like it did look before, and this will have consequences either now or later. So that I think it gives you an idea maybe also of the vitality of the stuff that's happening here. If you get a sense of what happened this year, of a lot of struggles, fights, discussions, that has to do with the shifting, let's say, makeup of Jewish population and the reestablishment of something I would call real diversity, something that may have been here until 33, and that kind of took a while. And I feel like now we are approaching something that I would call neue jüdische Lebendigkeit, new Jewish vitality, which is not the reestablishment of something that happened in Germany until 33, but rather something very new. And this is not only Soviet immigration, but it's also Israeli immigration, which has been mentioned in the chat a lot. And sorry for not picking up on all those questions, but I'm trying to kind of get through them a bit. So you have that. You have the former GDR, which is also now important because Jewish life in the former GDR didn't happen in synagogues. It happened in living rooms, and it was a political practice. The way I was raised was Judaism as an ethical, partisan, political identity, and not so much a religious Jewish identity. That only happened in the 90s with all the Jews coming from the Soviet Union, making it possible in Berlin to establish the first Jewish school after 45. So really, I'm already the product of a new Jewish population that makes it possible to establish something like education frameworks that are able to allow for a Jewish self-image that is not only connected to the outside. Mm-hmm. So there's something like an inner Jewish definition power that is now arising, but at the same time, it does mean that there's not one definition serving all the Jewish population. And this is, I think, where we see a tension arising between the symbolical Jewish side, which is supposedly unified, singular, not German, and non-ambivalent. And then on the other side, you have Jewish population, which is very ambivalent and very different. And you have queer Jews, and you have Jews coming from all over the place, speaking different languages, being part of different classes, economically speaking, having different political opinions, all that stuff that I don't have to explain to American Jews. But in Germany, it feels like, especially for a non-Jewish audience, that this is very new. Like, this is really shocking to them, that there's different kinds of Jewishness coexisting in Germany today. And that is good news, but it's still a long way to go to explain that to everyone involved. And I feel like a lot of the consequences on a structural level of the Soviet migration, they're still it's still open to be to happen, right? I mean, Daria could elaborate on that, but I feel like a lot of the changing structures of, for example, Zentralrat or other Jewish institutions, they are still outstanding. Like, there's still they haven't happened yet, but they will have to happen at a certain point.
Daria, what is the involvement of the former Soviet Jews in institutions like the Zentralrat currently? Is that something that is emerging?
Honestly, I cannot, like, I can say that I don't find, I can't give you numbers, but and maybe what was very important for this 1,700 year thingy that we are celebrating is this very strong symbolic representation of the Jewish diversity, because like the three big topics that dominated German discourse, like the Shoah, Israel, and religiosity, was this year, or over the last year, we have this new discourse about the vitality and the diversity of Jews, which don't only happen on the ground as a real vitality and diversity, but is also represented on a discursive level, often without actually telling the stories, the diversity of the stories that are out there. So for the whole element of the Soviet Jewish experience, the experiences of surviving the Shoah, the experiences of families where people died in mass executions in Ukraine, in Babin Yar or in Dnipropetrovsk, the surviving and evacuation in Central Asia is not yet part of any form of Jewish commemoration of the Shoah. So we have on the one side this this idea of diversity and of vital Jewish life that is, I really can't give you numbers of how many people with a Soviet Jewish background live and work in the Zentralrat. I can just tell that these stories and the experiences are not present in the discourse as the Zentralrat and as Jewish establishment are presenting them. And the way the story I put out from this exceptional welcome and idea of Jews revitalizing, Russian Jews revitalizing German Jewish life, that went over to this problem discourse. And in the last 10 years, we have this success story. And often it's a very empty success story. So there are like roughly 10 people or maybe 20 that are featured very prominently as examples for the success of Soviet Jewry, like musicians, like writers, doctors. But it's a very cherry-picking discourse that doesn't really introduce the actual lives and the histories into the broader discourse. And the interesting things are, like, if we look at Berlin, then we have about 60 Jewish non-governmental organizations outside the official structures. And this is where the really interesting stuff is happening. And we also have like something that was very, like a big difference to the US discourse, where Jewish life was much more bottom up and much more diverse, like from the beginning on. In the German case, it was very much like centralized in the community. And this is this new and interesting thing that happened over the last years, that Jewish life takes place outside those established communities, where also, like, we also have to see that many of only 50% of the people who immigrated as Soviet Jews to Germany ended up in the communities. We have no idea what happened to the other 50%, like other 100,000 Jews. Many of them could not enter the communities because they were seen as patrilinear Jews, like halachically not Jewish. But many were not interested in the communities because it was just not the most interesting part of, like, it was not very appealing what happened in the established communities in the 90s or 2000s. And I think that is really changing. And they are, yeah, interesting development happening in places like Berlin, where it's not only the children and grandchildren of the Soviet Jews, but also American Jews who come to Germany, because it's much more interesting what happens in places like Berlin, because it's dynamic, and the field beyond the Zentralrat is not so much, it's not already taken. It's very dynamic, and I find it quite interesting what kind of new developments we can see in terms of a reinvention of Orthodox Jewry, but also a reinvention of secularism and secular Jewish traditions, political Jewish traditions. And I believe that this development of a broader German society to acknowledging that it is a post-migrant society, and like a diverse, not only Jewish, but generally migrant diaspora living in several places in Germany, also allows the diversity of Jewish people to flourish and to build new alliances. And yeah, to live out and to kind of to explore and develop new forms of Judaism beyond, like, what I understand how it historically developed, but it often felt to me very exclusive and self-centered, what I found in Jewish communities in the 2000s in Germany. It was not, and it was hard to enter it also.
Yeah. Max, do you want to pick up there and talk about how this new Jewish vitality outside of, you know, centralized institutions is taking place? Like what examples of what Daria is talking about? I'm sure you've been involved in a few of them personally and know of others.
Just a few points. I won't claim to do a full overview, but Daria has already raised central elements of it. In a way, the Soviet migration, also the GDR Jews, were a great disappointment to the Jewish communities. And that has to do with the idea of a very religious note. Like, look, there's a confusion of like the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland actually being the Zentralrat der jüdischen Gemeinden in Deutschland. He's not the central council for all Jews, he's the central council for all Jewish communities. That's the structure he's representing. And this is less than 50% of the Jews living in Germany today. So we are talking about an institution that is being perceived as the central representation of Jews in Germany, but it's not a majority representation. So and there's already confusion. And then you have the Jewish community speakers trying to get the Soviet Jews to Germany, and the German side, and I just wanted to add that to what Daria said, the German side, of course, also inviting Jews from Soviet Union as an act of social engineering, of trying to have Jewish life in Germany, which for the German side is also very interesting. It's not only for the Jewish side. And now those people arrive, and a lot of them walk through communities, and then they just leave them again. And we can see how the expectation of the 90s of Jewish communities being the central hub for integration in German society did not play out. Like, it didn't work like this. So by now we can see, and that also has to do with the very silly, weird structure of and situation of the Jewish, especially the Jewish community in Berlin, Jüdische Gemeinde in Berlin, because it's insane. But like to see how, especially in Berlin, there's all those places where Jewish life springs up, and it's not Jewish communal life. It's the theaters where it happens, it's literature, it's music, it's cultural activities in general, it's political activities. So you find all those things happening. It's refugee help structures, you know, like you see those things happening, and it's just moving beyond the communal religious fold. And yet again, I feel like this is a good sign, it's not a good sign for people trying to to establish a unified image of what Jewish life is and how it could be defined. But what do we care? It's about revitalizing something like Jewish life in Germany today. And I feel like we have never had a better chance ever since 45 to reimagine Jewish life like this.
Right. So it's so that it's something that people live rather than something you can represent on an org chart.
Yeah, and this is what Daria, I think, means when she says it's so chaotic almost, and so like so, I don't know, like so pulsating that that you can't really, like, once you try to pin down Jewish life, it has already moved, and it represents the radical diversity German society is having, like is not only, like, it has been around for a while, but now it almost feels like it starts to slowly come to realize that this radical diversity exists, and that it actually forms the basis on which we have to imagine and reimagine society as it is today. And this is where the critique of integration concept comes from, to say, look, this integration paradigm establishes an idea of society working in a specific way with one center, a hierarchical order, and being relatively homogeneous, which is just not how plural democracies work in the 21st century, because they do not have this center. And it's true for Judaism as well, because it's part of the post-migrant Germany that we try to reimagine today.
So I don't want to put the brakes on the discussion of the present, but since we are the Leo Baeck Institute, and the Leo Baeck Institute is certainly engaged with and has among its concerns, post-war German Jewish life and the contemporary Jewish life in Germany. But we're really focused on this pre-1938 period, not even on the Holocaust. We're sort of a product of the Holocaust and the displacement of German-speaking Jews. But we represent this pre-1933 history, and it occurs to me that it's not a perfect analogy. No analogy is perfect, but I mean, the diversity that you're talking about is something that one could see or could claim to see in pre-1933 German Jewish life, broadly conceived, right? Like, you have just in religion, you have Germany as the source of the three major branches of Jewish religious practice outside of Orthodox or Hasidism. You've got conservative, Reform, and like modern Orthodox, neo-Orthodoxy coming out of Germany. You have Zionism coming from Germany. You have this secular Bildungsideal as a hallmark of German, as a creation or lived experience of this German Jewish pre-1933 world. So I'm wondering, and all of you could answer this. Maybe we could start with Atina and then go back to Max and Daria, just to get Atina back in the conversation. We're trying to span this Bogen, to create this 1700-year arc with this project, or at least there's an attempt being made to do that. And I'm wondering, what is the relevance of this past to people living Jewish lives, or lives connected to Jewish history and to Judaism in Germany today? Is it is it a usable past that's worth connecting to? Or is it just, I don't know, how are people relating that to that now? I mean, it's certainly, Atina, maybe you can just take it from there before I
well,
myself
first
too deep.
of all, unfortunately, I have not spent as much time as I would have liked to in Germany or in Berlin, which is
right. You were supposed to be in Berlin right now.
I was supposed to be in Berlin right now, and we were all going to go out and have drinks after we did this session, but that didn't happen. So, I think Max and Daria have more to say, perhaps, than I do. I would just maybe add from do I think that there is sort of a direct resonance, I mean, never mind relevance of this vaunted German Jewish legacy, and I really think we should abolish that word legacy.
I didn't say it.
I know, but that's sort of
that's what I was getting at.
Has been part of sort of LBI rhetoric. I actually don't think there is that much of an arc to be made, which doesn't mean that it isn't historically interesting and that it can't be of particular interest, for example, to the great-grandchildren of German Jews who pursued a certain continuation of German Jewish life in Buenos Aires, in Sydney, in Cape Town, in New York, in London, and now maybe, sort of doing their stints in Berlin. I think they're, and I also think this is particularly true also for Israelis, who, not unlike the post-Soviet Jews in a different way, I think were just a quote unquote disappointment or a bit of a shock in that many of the Israelis who settled in Germany, and of course the numbers are disputed and how long do they stay and this and that and the other thing, but they were very often among the most articulate critics of Israeli policies, particularly in regard to Palestinians, as well as to religious control, which has led to all kinds of really interesting and maddening and also challenging and productive conversations. But I think that one of the sort of main discontinuities, if you will, is that I think the real challenge, as I see it, and it's based on a lot of my experience with ELIS, with Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich Studienwerk, which is this fellowship foundation that supports Jewish students, loosely defined, who matriculate at German universities. Max is an alum, one of our illustrious alums, is that the generations change, and this current generation that I'm seeing, it seems to me, has a threefold challenge. I mean, they, much more than any group earlier, they have had a full socialization within the institutions that were set up by this Central Council of Jewish Communities, as Max very correctly points out, in Germany. And they, many of them have gone to the Jewish schools, or they've been in youth groups, different youth groups than the generation that came out in the 80s, who had been in, really Zionist youth groups and then had their own coming out and disillusionment in the 1980s. And they have, I think, a different sense of confidence in their being Jewish, which allows for more thinking about diversity. It means that there is quite a bit of looking inward, which is perhaps different than what we saw in the 90s and the 2000s. So that this whole question of making alliances with other immigrants, with migrants, with other victims of racism, with people who come as refugees, particularly quote unquote Muslim refugees, is in some ways a contested issue, because there's this sense of we want to focus on our own understanding of how we can build a Jewish life. There's a really large number of younger Jews who are studying in Germany. This is new, who are studying to be rabbis and cantors of different denominations, and that in and of itself is going to be fascinating, because one of the sort of best kept open secrets of organized Jewish life in Germany has been that many of the rabbis for all kinds of, understandable historical reasons, many of the rabbis who've been sort of enforcing these rules of who is Jewish and who isn't Jewish are themselves converts. They are the offspring of 4 generations of Protestant pastors who, felt maybe a genuine calling to Jewish religion. That is actually changing to some degree now that we have a younger generation of Jews who are wanting to actually take on those positions. So there's, I think, a tension between saying, look, we need to focus on ourselves, and the question of how do we make alliances and how do we express solidarity with other non-Bio-Deutschen? In other words, the sort of alliance against, die Menschen mit Migrantenhintergrund, to put it polemically, gegen die Menschen mit Nazi-Hintergrund, right? And that is, I think, a very complicated question, and people sort of fall on different sides, and that the challenge. Okay, let me just say one more thing. That's why I think that this concept of shared history of Germans and Jews is not very workable for the current situation, because it's not anymore about Germans and Jews. It's about how to live within an increasingly multicultural society in which another religion, namely Islam, is becoming more important. It's not about, Jewish Christian, fellowship. Those are not the hot, important challenges of the moment. So in that sense, it's no longer about figuring out the shared history of Germans and Jews. It's about figuring out how to share life as citizens in a very different Germany. So that's why I would say the legacy is not so relevant.
I'm going to stop. Thank you, Atina. Daria, so the question was about the use of this pre-1933 past for German Jewish life today. And I think, Atina made a good case that it's interesting, but perhaps not the burning issue for people today. What do you think?
I mean, I picked up on this idea of secular Judaism, Hasidism, like everything what represented German Jewish culture until the 1930s, and how much it was influenced by Eastern Europe already then. I mean, there was like the Zionist culture, Haskalah was all invented and came over from Eastern Europe. This new Hasidic traditions were also influenced by migration processes. So, I mean, the whole idea of Jewish history as a diasporic history is counters and questions these national narratives that we have established since the 19th century. You cannot tell a Jewish history in these national frames. You have to think about it through migration processes, through conflicts between secularization and like reinvention of religious traditions, also through the conflicts that come with it, and through the continuation. Like, I find it really interesting. What is this? Where is this continuous devaluation of Eastern European experience comes from? Like, why is it so formative in the 1930s? Why is it still present in contemporary Germany? Also, if I compare the experience of post-Soviet Jews in Israel and also in the US, these migrants very much adapted, but there's really a problem of accessing the Eastern European and Soviet Jewish history by now. It's really difficult to get hold of their own stories, and people feel weirdly ashamed of not living up to this dominant Ashkenazi idea of what Jews are, even if they are kind of pass as Ashkenazi or pass is in this to this idea of what it means to be Jewish. So what is it? I'm really curious, and I try to understand further this complicated relationship of German Jewry to Eastern European heritage. And I also, like, speaking about these, like last point, speaking about this diversification of Jewish life, that also means that we have new narratives and new forms of relating to historical heritage. And one of the narratives, interestingly, is I encountered it really only a couple of weeks ago, is returning to Ashkenaz of the Soviet Jews, which I find interesting, and also a reconnection of the secular ideas of German Jewry with the Soviet secular tradition, which is quite important. So I think there are like some ways we can maybe don't find continuities, but historical resonances.
Yeah.
And I think that is also important because, like, we had this discussion about who counts as a Jew and how important is halakha to define who is Jewish in contemporary Germany. And it's really interesting how the historical experience of secular Judaism, which was so formative for a German Jewish society, just played no role in this whole discussion. I mean, this is really interesting because we have the halakha is not so important for communist Jews, Zionist Jews, Soviet Jews, and also Eastern German secular Jews. This is that, like, it's really like there is also a way of losing the German Jewish history in the contemporary debate through this, through a very narrow idea of the ideal Jew. So I believe if we work on entangled histories or shared histories and finding also, comparisons or resonances between different Jewish experiences in different times and places, and this is something that the various young Jewish people who live today in Germany, not only in Berlin, but also in Frankfurt and in smaller places like Erfurt or Kiel, do very much. They connect the stories they bring with themselves to the stories they find at the places where they live, and they connect those different strands. And this is, this is for me the whole idea about diaspora culture and diaspora Judaism.
Thanks, Daria. Max?
Yeah, final statement, no? Well, thank you, Atina and Daria. This is already like a great canvas of what we're talking about, or what we could take out of history, and how the present is not comparable to history, but rather the history is a place where we may be able to learn about strategies people developed, Jewish diversity that actually existed until 1933, and how the way Nazi Germany started to differentiate two groups which did not actually exist like this before 1933. So you see how the Jew and the German is being constructed after 1933 as two opposite sides, which really, we should be careful not to reproduce this idea. The stuff we call Jewish history is also part of what German history became. Like, you have this whole, like, also with this 1,700 years celebration, what you can see is that you celebrate minority cultures the moment they start to be relevant for the majority culture. So it's almost like at the intersection, die Schnittstelle of the German and the Jewish side. This is the story you can tell. You can see it with the funding of a 1,700 year program, that you cannot apply for programs that are only inner Jewish. They have to be Jewish German. So you see how this idea of intersection, of staging of Jewish culture for a German majority is being demanded. And it's been the story that we still tell. And I feel like if we change this point of view, if we would start to think about German culture as something that grows out of the difference of its respective communities and people, not as something that has been established and then the Jews come and they help, and then the, I don't know, the women come and they help, but rather that it's only the result of that difference and of those different inspirations, then we may get closer to a recognition of the relevance of this past for our presence, because if we retell history, we'll be able to retell the present. So I feel like, yes, history is important, but it's also important how we tell it. And then if we talk about the theater of, memory culture, I feel like there's a lot to be learned from the past. Like if we talk about especially Jewish experience in Germany, there was an intense desire to integrate, an intense desire to become German. And it almost feels like this desire to become German was so profound that people could not believe what happened in 33, because they had given away all their resources to act in opposition to the German state, because they had kind of desired to become part of the German state, to become German all their lives over generations. So what we can learn from this in a way, and that is the integration also, what we can learn from this from a Jewish perspective is that we have to maintain a certain degree of difference to maintain our potential to resist. So also from that point of view, integration is or assimilation is something that we can learn from history, does not work very well with regard to a militant democracy, wehrhafte Demokratie. So in a way, I feel like there's stuff to be learned from the past, not in order to repeat the past, but rather to try to establish a present that allows us to move forward, not to repeat the past. And there was one question in the Q&A about how could Jews live in Germany after 45? Well, it's not on me to decide, because I'm already way down the line of my grandfather deciding to live in Germany. But I feel like now, with the post-migrant discourse, it feels like it's the best chance we have to establish a Germany that is moving beyond this framework that made things possible, like Nazi rule.
Well, thank you, Max. I think that's a great closing thought, and we're at almost an hour and a half. And thanks also, I think all of you we're keeping an eye on the Q&A and have acknowledged many of the points there. So I'm sorry we didn't get to specific questions, but we covered an awful lot of territory. And I also want to acknowledge that our panelists, especially Max and Daria, just got their boosters. So they've really done they've done us all a great favor and service by being here with us. So thank you both, and thank you, Atina, for your excellent overview. Yeah, and yeah, I mean,
next year in Berlin, Berlin.
Yeah.
Yeah, next time in Berlin.
Nachon.
And speaking of next year, also thanks to our audience. This is our last event of 2021, and it's really gratifying to see so many of you join us at noon. At a very chaotic time with a lot of distractions. So thank you for coming. Thanks for hanging in there, and stay tuned to the Leo Baeck Institute. We're on the internet at www.lbi.org, and we'll be announcing new programs for 2022. Hopefully, may they all be as interesting or half as interesting as this one. So thank you all, and I'm going to say good afternoon. And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Yes.
Thanks. Guten Rutsch.
Cheers.
Bye. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye bye.